So without further ado, we're going to move on to our first session, focusing on contemporary air and space power, including lessons from current conflicts. Now, as Greg has already mentioned, we do want to ensure that this conference is as interactive as possible, and we want your views, we want your questions, we want your insights as well to feed in to the discussions. So you can do that in a number of ways. We do have roving microphones that if you raise your hand will come over to you and you can ask a question. But also we're using Slido here at the conference. And so there is the Slido code, and you can scan that, and that will mean that you can pose those questions through the Slido app on your phones. Remember to keep your phones on silent, of course. And those questions will come through to me, and then I will put them to the panel. So you can either raise your hand or ask questions via Slido. So I am very pleased to say we have a very esteemed first panel of speakers. They're going to outline their first thoughts, and then we'll open to the Q&A. So please do welcome to the stage Professor Justin Bronk, Senior Research Fellow from RUSI, who is already very well known to many of you. Welcome, Justin, do take a seat. Great to have you here again. Julia Balm from the Freeman Air and Space Institute at King's College London, who is our expert on space. Hello there, Julia. Great to have you with us. Please welcome as well Dr. Brendan Mulvaney, who's the director of the China Aerospace Studies Institute based in Washington, D.C. Hello, Brendan. And from industry, a warm welcome to Tom Jones, corporate vice president and president from Northrop Grumman Aeronautics System. Welcome. You want to take a seat just there? Thank you very much. And by last, but by no means least, General Jeff Cobra Harrigian, who is Vice President of Strategic Campaigns at Lockheed Martin Aeronautics. So welcome to you all. As I mentioned, I'd just like you to outline your first thoughts when we're looking at what we can learn from current conflicts in terms of air and space power. Justin, would you like to begin?
Thanks very much, Susanna. Good morning. You can see air and space power is always a mixed bag. They've made a mistake up front. They've invited me to speak again, but they've learned I've only got 6.5 minutes. So let's start with the bad points, get those out of the way. First of all, the war in Ukraine at the moment, we're currently on a pathway towards Ukraine losing, bluntly. It can still be turned around. There is still a path to a much more acceptable outcome. But on the current trajectory, Ukraine loses slowly at first and then potentially very quickly. So everything that we're going to hear about for the rest of the day will potentially, I suspect, draw on a lot of the lessons on innovation, novel use of technologies, cheap mass, all of the good things the Ukrainians are doing with help from partners. It is worth stating up front, Russia is neither deterred by any of those things and is not losing because of any of those things. So if we're counting on importing those approaches across to ourselves, it's worth being upfront about the fact that those have not proven strategically decisive, let alone tactically or operationally overwhelming on the Ukrainian side. Secondly, the Russians show no sign whatsoever of backing down. They've lost more than 500,000 killed and seriously wounded. They've lost more than 3,000 tanks verified, and these are the individually image-verified numbers, not the likely totals. More than 110 aeroplanes, about 130 helicopters. If you look through these losses and then think that this is a country that is going to back down because they wouldn't really risk a war with us, would they? You're not paying attention to either Russian behavior or Russian political discourse. The arguments continue to be about when and how they widen the war, not about whether they keep fighting it. So we are going to have a huge problem with the Russians in Europe in the foreseeable next few years. I've said over the last couple of times been invited here to speak that we have maybe 4 or 5 years to get ourselves in order. Well, 2 years have gone past and it's now 2 or 3 years. We need to be ready by 2028 to warfight against the Russians because we may not have a choice about it. If they think they can get away with taking a small amount of NATO territory to trigger an Article 5 to which they think we cannot respond, they will do it. Or at least there is a very, very high chance that they will do it. So we have to be ready for that. Other bad news, cupboards are pretty empty throughout Europe. and the need to desperately get Ukraine more equipment to try and change that trajectory, particularly air defense ammunition, is not making that any easier, but we have no choice. We have to do both. And the longer Ukraine stays in the fight, obviously, the more time we have for us, but that is not a particularly good way of looking at things in terms of being a good ally. We need to turn things around in Ukraine, but also we have to get our own defenses in order in the next 2 to 3 years. Unfortunately, as all of you know, budgets are not going up in most countries, stand fast Poland, by nearly as much as the threat would demand. So unfortunately, if you're going to reorientate your air forces quickly, and you do need to do it quickly, for the next 2 to 3 years, you don't have time to buy new platforms, you don't have time to budget towards new platforms, and unless you start planning and spending as if this is a crisis, it's very difficult for you to win the arguments with your governments that this is a crisis they need to fund as such, if you are actually just submitting a variation on the plan you had already with maybe a bit more ammunition. The good side of things, firstly, because procurement's quite slow, and because militaries don't like to change, the ironic thing is that despite 20, 25 years of counterinsurgency and interventions, most of our air forces are still equipped with things that were purpose-designed and built to kill the Russians. Ironically enough, what do we all fly? Typhoon, built to kill flankers. F-35, built to take down Russian air defense networks. What do we fire? AMRAAM, built to kill flankers. Meteor, built to kill flankers. What do we have in the stocks? Brimstone, built to kill Russian tanks. Maverick, built to kill Russian tanks. You know, there is a theme here. And in a lot of cases, the threat also isn't as innovative or as different as people say it is. Your biggest problems for air forces, for the army, they have to deal with a whole host of small, massed, short-range UAVs of every conceivable kind. They have to deal with a lot of tactical EW. But air forces mostly have to deal with things that we've known about for a very long time. S-400 was designed in the 90s. Flanker was designed in the 80s, updated in the 2010s. Even Felon is a design from the 90s. Archer, Axehead, they're all old missiles. These are systems we know and understand, and the threat hasn't actually changed that much. So we've already got most of the tools we need, we just don't have nearly enough of them. So given you have 2 to 3 years, and you have to be ready by that point, if I sound a bit alarmed, it's because I am. Stop looking at large-scale procurement programs for the next little while. If you've got aircraft on order now, great, keep them in the pipeline, but other than that, you don't have time to have new orders delivered. Buy ammunition, buy spares, increase the size of your maintenance contracts for your key fleets, focus your airtime, your crucial live flying hours, on critical mission sets. Stop doing discretionary deployments around the world. It burns mission readiness. And you know, when you look at things like a defense review or your forward plan and how you try and adjust to meet those demands coming out of Aircom, who are doing a load of really, really good work on this, try and think with each decision, am I going to desperately regret if we have to fight in 2 to 3 years' time that I wasted money on this, rather than giving my pilots, my crews, the ammunition, the parts to fly, and the training time to be actually ready to fight an opponent who will kill them if they're not ready? You don't have long. Sorry to be blunt. That's me.
Thank you very much, Justin. We like you being blunt here at this conference, and certainly a lot of food for thought. We already have questions coming in, but I'm going to move on to Julia Balm from the Freeman Air and Space Institute. Julia, can you give me your first takes on the lessons we should be learning from current conflict?
Thanks. So I'd like to zoom out a bit and draw on some aspects where space has and will continue to change the character of war. I think what Ukraine has really demonstrated is that space is critical to the battlefield, but not just this. You know, the first attack on Russia's invasion of Ukraine was hours before the ground invasion with the cyber attack on a satellite communications company. I think that's indicative of the point that Russia's approach to lessening advantage is through the space domain. And that's a tactic that we're going to see moving forward. The big question now is whether planners can take advantage of eyes and ears to form effective and adequate strategy. The concept of eyes and ears has now evolved, and it's important to grapple with what's changed. I think we're finally asking ourselves not only whose eyes and ears, but now who is providing those eyes and ears. With each passing conflict, industry and industry's relevance is now gaining a lot more presence in the operation command chain. I think that's something that has to be recognized. If we're looking at, you know, Space's support to Ukraine. We're talking about high-resolution satellite imagery, sort of opening the battlefield and being able to track developments in infrastructure, whether that's minefields or trenches, but also revealing Russia's logistical problems and information advantage. But perhaps the largest thing in terms of what space has offered to the battlefield is a recognition that having a clear picture of the battlefield is the absolute baseline for developing a strategy. And so just to sort of hone in on one particular aspect, I'd like to focus on satellite images because they've had a demonstrable impact in the torque of the conflict. Satellite images have provided high-resolution satellite imagery, as I mentioned, but more so it's about countering disinformation, about opening up the conflict to public perception, providing vital evidence of Russia's war crimes, which is going to be increasingly important to keep track of. But they've also offered unprecedented transparency on the toll of modern warfare. And as the technologies have advanced, I think the public's willingness to engage with satellite images has really taken off. This is a war that now not only engages experts and those in the room here, but also the open source researcher and analyst, and more so the general public. The willingness and the manner in which users are ingesting and using data has changed. And I'm not going to get into sort of the law of quantum mechanics, but I might. It is worth considering just how the act of observation is changing the subject itself. And further to that point, there's an increasing importance in public perceptions, especially if we're talking about commercial actors concerned with image, with PR, and certainly concerned naturally with stakeholder perception. Moving forward, I think ensuring that all actors are pursuing that which most supports national interest and supplies adequate infrastructure to the national posture is going to be increasingly important, not only for all the states fighting, but especially for the West. And we've seen, in terms of countering the advantages that I mentioned, we've seen Russia try to counter the eyes and ears advantage through, as I mentioned, hacking, but also jamming, peresvet, krakushka, threatening to shoot satellites down. This saber rattling and threatening is only going to increase. That sort of speaks to the point where the more useful space is becoming, the more vulnerable it's going to be. Moscow's focus on jamming and degrading critical UAVs and small satellites to conceal its troop movements is likewise a tactic we're going to see moving forward. And threats of targeting, as I mentioned, will grow. Moscow stressed that commercial satellites represent legitimate targets, which is quite threatening if we're not adequately prepared to defend that. So not only are these questions circulating around commercial assets, but it's also an important point to note that these are not Ukrainian satellites. Ukraine doesn't own any satellites. So we're talking about expanding and escalating the conflict if we're talking about targeting sort of non-sovereign assets in war. And this is a risk that kind of goes back to the big question that I mentioned earlier, which is who is providing these eyes and ears? And sort of three main takeaways that I'd put for lessons for future war, I'd say the first is the pace of movement is going to be much quicker in the next war. Timing is going to be critical, not only in terms of speed of reaction and action, but also in terms of the choices that are made in the earliest days. The second point that I'd make is that the next war is going to be operating with a vastly different space domain. If we consider that today there's approximately 10,200 satellites in orbit, the number is predicted by 2030 to be about 60,000, with more ambitious and bold estimates citing 100,000. I think it's a bit bold. But to even consider 60,000 by 2030, we're talking about approximately doubling the eyes in the sky every year. And this is not only, if we're talking about whose eyes and ears, the cost of launch going down and space becoming more accessible, it's not just more friends in orbit, it's also more foes. And so the final point on that, I'd say, is while space alone cannot win wars, pitting services against each other in rhetoric amounting to debates on, ammunition versus satellites, is in no way going to produce a mutually supportive MDO. The ubiquity of space technology and the degree to which it's integrated into other things across the whole of defense is worth noting if we're having this debate about whether space is a domain or an enabler. I think you can't debate the criticality of it. And what space offers the battlefield is not only, and I've mentioned this earlier, not only critical and important, but it also speaks to the sheer fact that the more situational awareness you have, the more advantage you have. And so just to sort of summarize what I've just said, I'd say, eyes and ears are going to grow in their importance in terms of advantage on the battlefield, and the ability for planners to not only take advantage of them, but also maintain them is going to grow in importance as well. If we're not prepared to fight blind in the future wars, then what is being done to ensure that those who are providing eyes and ears are safeguarded against the rise of disruptive actors?
Okay, thank you very much. It's a good question to end on, and one that we shall come back to. Now I'd like to hand over to Brendan Mulvaney from the China Aerospace Studies Institute. Brendan, over to you.
Great, well thanks, and thanks for having me back. Like Justin, wasn't so sure after last year, but that's good. So I'm just gonna take a few minutes to talk about the broad overview of China, about the Communist Party of China, and its goals for its armed wing, the People's Liberation Army. So first, we need to stop talking about China as a near-peer competitor. It is a peer. It is a peer competitor to every nation represented here today, and the CCP has a very clear vision for where they want to be by 2049. And that is, in their own words, the center of the world stage with a world-class military to back it up. Xi Jinping, the General Secretary of the Communist Party and the Chairman of the Central Military Commission, has put a lot of focus on the aerospace power of China. And in fact, we've provided everyone here, if you want a copy, there are plenty out there, the Red Book from GASCC. It is a primer on everything that has to do with PLA aerospace power. And I highly recommend it because it is important for everyone to know the thing with which we're competing. We need to be very clear that the preparations for war for the PLA are real and they are earnest and they are working very quickly to achieve those aims. We always need to remind people that the People's Liberation Army is not a national military. It is not there to serve the interests of China or the people of China. It is the armed wing of the Communist Party. And because of that, their perspectives, their outlooks, and the ways they are going to approach problems are just different from ours. We need to look at it through the lens of how are the Chinese going to solve Chinese problems with Chinese solutions and not simply mirror image. They perceive our existence, groups like this, as a threat to themselves and into their entire ideology. So it's important to understand that the PRC shaping effort is already occurring in your nation. Everyone is being subject to this, and their shaping of your society is already underway. We see this through traditional media, through social media. Revelations like the Volt Typhoon just show how advanced China has gone into the systems of all of our nations in order to lay the battlefield. The information operations continue apace. What they are trying to do is to get across to the people of your nations that it isn't worth it to fight China. And it isn't worth it for your nations to call out China when they break the international norms and rules of behavior that we have all agreed to. We need to remind people that everything that Chinese companies, that academics and researchers do is fed directly back into that CCP-directed system, and it all goes to strengthen their comprehensive national power. That means it is going to make the PLA stronger. It's important to understand that they are looking to learn and to leverage other nations' military and technology and people, and we need to do something about that. Even if conflict between your country and China is unlikely, your military, your government, and your society are already a target of the Chinese intelligence services and possibly for technology acquisition and cyber espionage. China's air forces aim to develop a capability that is going to be global, and it won't be a not my problem for very long for anyone in this room. They already threaten space. To dovetail on what Julie was talking about, we must have a collaborative space policy and an industrial policy among like-minded nations that is viable and is commercially acceptable. PLA technology and equipment is advancing rapidly, and they have a suite of modern platforms and systems across the board, and all of this with a single focus, counter-intervention, to keep you and your forces out long enough for them to do what they want to accomplish. So what are they doing? Really quickly, long-range air missiles, the PL-15, 17, 21. The J-20 and the J-15 don't need to be as good as an F-35, an NGAD, or a GCAP if they can simply prevent you from getting close to them. And that also goes for the long logistics trails of the Pacific for tankers and support aircraft. Advanced surface-to-air missiles as part of the deepest, most advanced integrated air defense system in the world with both space, air, land, and sea components, again, focused on keeping you out. New space-based capabilities, space planes, fractional orbital bombardment systems, grappling satellites, and a host of counter space capabilities, including lasers, high-power microwaves, etc., all as well as kinetic operations, obviously, all with the goal from Xi Jinping of becoming the largest spacefaring nation on the face of the earth. They have an ambition to put up 13,000 satellites, to just dovetail on Julia's comments there. That is no small task, but they have a system and a program and a policy that will enable them to get there. And all of this is working across the entire full spectrum. And again, they are proceeding apace, not to mention nuclear weapons and potentially putting conventional warheads on an ICBM. Think about what that does to deterrence and alliance politics and reactions. So while they're not there yet, you could bet that China wants to do in aviation what they've done in the maritime domain. As most of you know, one single shipyard in China is greater than the entire shipbuilding capacity of the United States. And all together, everything in China is 230 times what we have. They want to do that same thing for aviation, and that absolutely will have an impact for everyone in this room. The good news is the PLA personnel still have time, still have things to make up in education and technology. They've removed not one but two ministers of defense and foreign ministers, not to mention the rocket force. So corruption is an issue and on their way to building a world-class military. None of this is to say we don't need to work with China if you want to solve the next pandemic. This group has started the Global Air Chiefs climate change program that they're working on. We need China. If you are worried about climate change, you can't do it without China. So I'm not saying we need to cut them off, but we need to engage them and we need to be clear-eyed about it. It is time for the free nations of the world to recognize this challenge for what it is and to do something about it. It is a time of consequence, which is driving the need for adaptability, for resilience, and for agility to meet this challenge. This is especially true of the air and space forces, because we need to explain to our own citizens and the people of the world and the population that we have a better vision for humanity, where one of like-minded nations can prosper together, but this requires work. It requires interoperability, not just flying next to each other, but with each other. Sharing technology, information, TTPs, and intelligence is going to be crucial to maintaining strategic deterrence, and this goes through for the military capability as well as economic and industrial systems. And to close, as our former DASD has said, the wolf's strength is in the pack, and the pack's strength is the wolf. Collective alignment is the best deterrent going, but this entails an obligation for self-improvement and for unity and interoperability, and the highest level of integration is absolutely needs to be the focus now. Thank you.
Brendan, thank you very much. So clearly not just a cross-force but cross-societal approach needed. It seems clear. We've got lots more questions coming in for both Brendan and Julia as well. We'll come to them, but first let's hear from Tom Jones, Corporate Vice President and President from Northrop Grumman.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to focus for my prepared remarks on the lessons we in industry are taking away as we look at some of the current conflicts and what that means for both how we design, build, and procure weapon systems in the future and modernize the ones that we have. So I think there's kind of two big lessons I've walked away with watching. And the first is the speed of innovation as we watch progress going from effect to countermeasure, to countermeasure, to countermeasure. I'm not going to continue, but you know where that leads, right? It just goes on and on and on. And that time, as we've seen in a number of recent conflicts, is really shrinking a lot, which has pretty profound implications on how we architect our systems to make sure we have the ability to keep up with that speed of innovation. The second point is, as we look at these innovations being introduced into the battlefield, the importance of being able to introduce those new capabilities, be the initial effect or the countermeasure somewhere downstream, but to apply those new capabilities at scale, simply because the speed of innovation is so quick. If you want to get a tactical advantage from deploying these, you have to do it at scale, or we'll already be at a point where the adversary has evolved a countermeasure against your new effect. So what does that mean as we look at the procurement of new systems? I'm going to look at software, I'm going to look at hardware, I'm going to try, if I've got time, to address industrial base capacity at the end as well. I think, number one, if you look at software, we've been talking about open architecture systems for years now. Many new systems that are being procured have these open architecture systems. It's imperative that we as an industrial base and our customers embrace that mindset, because that's what we're going to need to rapidly innovate as we go out there. But we're also going to have to modernize the way we do software. We're going to have to think about not just incorporation of agile software practices, but building out full-blown software factories that speed the time from code development to code delivery, test, and operational fielding, and make that an industry best practice. And that's something that we're looking at quite a bit on some of our newer programs that we have. As we look at hardware, and I'm going to focus, I am the head of the aeronautics sector. It looks like you're showing pictures of some of our kit behind me right now. I'm going to focus primarily on aircraft and weapons systems. I think what we need to do is, as we procure new systems, we really need to focus, number one, on making sure that they're built with adequate size, weight, and power margin going in to rapidly evolve, whether we need bigger computers that require more power or new electronic warfare systems that weigh more. We have to have that margin built in up front. And that is largely not the way we procure a lot of our new weapon systems. We try and wring every last bit of performance out of them. And while there's margin there, there's not margin that's going to accommodate the types of innovation cycles that we might need to focus. We really need to look, I think, as we develop new systems, at making sure we put that in a premium. Let me cover real quick a few trends. Low-cost drones, Justin mentioned, mainly an Army problem, but I will tell you also, if you look at the Middle East, we've seen them used against what I'd call more traditional weapon systems. And if nothing else, it can certainly deplete the magazine depth, which ends up having a strategic effect. So I think we need to look at how we develop counter-UAS systems. Again, the innovation cycle that we're seeing in these low-cost drones when they're used against big, mainline, expensive weapon systems, we're going to have to figure out how we can employ that agile loop and adopt those two methodologies that I spoke about before. We've also seen an interest in loyal wingmen or collaborative combat aircraft, which I think is a great move to getting more affordable mass to accommodate some of the attrition levels that Julia mentioned that we can see, and Justin mentioned that we can see in these larger scale conflicts. I do think we need to pay attention that we get the requirements right as we go forward and do this. More operational analysis on really looking at what makes these not just decoys or drones, but things that bring tactical utility to the warfighter. In particular, I'm concerned that we understand the survivability requirements, and I'm not saying everything has to look like a B-21, but there's probably a fine line between getting the survivability of a platform right, so it can deliver a effect, and where it would be much less effective at doing that. As soon as we bring survivability into the equation, it puts constraints on the outer mold line of the aircraft. And I think, again, that drives us to the point that I made at the beginning. If we're going to be fixed in our outer mold line, that takes a long time to redesign and retest and recertify. It means we have to have the margin built into the systems that we're procuring as we go out so that they can adapt as we go forward. Lastly, I'll touch real quickly on industrial base depth. The ability to ramp to get our factories going, basically limited by supply chain, by manufacturing tooling, by the span times for the things that we build, and by our ability to increase rate, which is a product kind of all the previous things that I mentioned in here. There are some innovations that are out there that are being looked at, both by Northrop Grumman. I believe a number of our industry teammates and colleagues are looking at them as well. I think hold a lot of promise. Additive manufacturing is one, determinate assembly is another, that have the ability to really compress the way we do this. But I would also argue that we need to fundamentally look, particularly in the area of new weapon systems procurements, about how we procure things, because we can squeeze a lot of procurement, development, manufacturing time out of the front end, but if we don't fundamentally look at how we specify and acquire systems on the front end, I think we're only achieving a portion of the speed that's going to be required for the challenges we have in the future. So with that, I'll turn the mic back over. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom, there. Now, let's hear from Jeff Cobra Harrigan about Lockheed Martin's perspective. Thank you.
Hey, thanks. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit from my perspective as the AFCENT commander in the Middle East, my time in Europe, and now my year and a half with Lockheed, in a mix of those when it as it relates to contemporary air and space power. 3 topics I'd like to cover. I'd like to start with information sharing. With this crowd, I think it's only appropriate we talk about air superiority, and then finally ensure we talk a little bit about agility. And so if I can step back, and Justin will recall this, to the early days in terms of what we knew was coming as the Russians were preparing to invade Ukraine. I would highlight to all of us that one of the key success stories was the way that collectively we were able to share information from the strategic level all the way down to the tactical level. That was underpinned by what I would classify as really good planning, not only from the U.S. perspective, but I know Johnny's here from the AirCom's perspective, and General Hector's here as well, that set the framework for ensuring that collectively, from the top level at the political levels all the way down to the tactical level, we had alignment and a shared understanding of what was occurring. We were leveraging tools across multiple classification levels to include space, other intel technologies that facilitated not only our ability to share the information and know what's going on, but then leverage that for future planning as we look to set our posture going forward. I think importantly, it provided the why to all that were involved, so that then we could look at the appropriate resources that would be required, get into the planning, do some of the deliberate planning that would be required to ensure that we were prepared, particularly on the Eastern Front, for any of the possibilities that could have come from that particular situation as it unraveled. I would offer to everyone in the room that we cannot go back to the way we used to do business. When we talk about deterring China and ensuring that collectively we understand what they're doing across all domains, that we must continue in a very deliberate fashion to share that information and ensure that collectively we have an understanding of where they're going, what they're thinking, so that, again, we can look at our resources and do the appropriate planning to prepare ourselves to do those types of activities. Second point I would bring up, again, I think is an important one, and Justin and I have talked about this previously, is the requirement for air superiority. Arguably, had one of the nations gained air superiority early in the fight, we would have a completely different conversation right now. Completely different. Recognizing, though, that gaining air superiority is something that has got to be earned. And I think we've talked about it in a myriad of different situations, but it starts with the right capabilities, the right capacities. Those could be all different types of capacities depending upon the situation. And then those entities need to be trained and ready. And I think collectively, as we look at that, we understand there are difficult decisions across all our nations, whether it be the resources required to make that happen, the training that's required, how we organize ourselves. Those are a lot of things that people are looking at right now. But at the same time, I think it's important that we realize and go back into history and recognize our duty is to be prepared to gain air superiority to support our joint forces and ultimately our collective national objectives to achieve what we're trying to do. And if we forget that or say it's too hard, then I don't believe we're doing the appropriate things that are necessary for our sons and daughters to live in the environment that we desire in the future. So I think it's important that we reflect on that and then take the time to do the necessary operational analysis and work that will be necessary to put the right capabilities in the hands of our daughters and our sons so that when we ask them to go out there and execute, they are able to do that and are ready to do that in a manner that we would all expect. Third piece I'd like to highlight is agility. And I'm going to talk to this from both an operational perspective and from an industry perspective. And Tom, you kind of hit upon it just in your comments there. 2019, General Brown and I started out on our journey to talk about agile combat employment and helping people understand why we thought that was important, particularly as we eyed not only the Russian threat, but also the threat in China and what it was going to take to go out and execute that. We developed concepts of operations, the concepts of employment, and thought our way through that. What I would tell you is what we did not understand is the impact it would have on our people. We have recognized the importance of empowering people, delegating down to allow them to go execute the mission that will be required of them, because we know there will be challenges from a connectivity perspective. We also know that there's been years and years of us operating in a fairly, an environment that allowed us to operate with freedom of maneuver. We're not going to have that to the extent we have had over the last few years, and now we've got to be prepared to accept some risk. Risk at the political level, risk at the operational level. We're going to have leaders that are willing to recognize mistakes will be made, and that's got to go across all the echelons, because job one, we have to trust them in the trenches. Job two, they got to trust us. Because if they don't trust us, they're not going to be able to or have the opportunity to lean in and make the decisions we need them to make to execute the missions. So I think it's important to acknowledge that. Finally, from an industry perspective, agility to deliver software, I would say importantly, the agility to listen to the warfighters, understand the problem set, dig into specific kill chains, decompose them to a level of specificity that we can now partner to understand the problem and then deliver at speed and at scale based on the particular problem that's in front of us. So I think all of those are important parts of where we have learned lessons, but have a long way in front of us going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, General. And without further ado, let's plough into the first questions that have come through, because we have a lot. I'll go to some questions from the floor in just a moment. But on that last point that you made, talking about this real need for agility and for industrial partners to lean in and listen, we have a question which has come through. How should industrial aerospace partners ready themselves for a hot war? It's a popular question. General, can I get your perspective first before I ask Tom?
Well, I think the first piece is partnering with the customer to understand the requirements and look at it from not only the capacity perspective and numbers, but digging into what are the priority mission sets, understanding what those are, and then working to find out what are those types of things we can deliver on quickly, where can we iterate with them to produce at the numbers that will be required for whatever particular conflict we could expect. At the same time, I think it's important, as we have in this the title of the conference, much of this will help in the deterrent value that we need to have to demonstrate that we're ready to go use these capabilities.
Okay, Tom?
So I think there's kind of two time horizons we've been talking about here, right? One is, potentially almost imminent, where we really have to worry about the depth of the industrial base. I think making sure we have a solid supply chain, and that's hard because in the avionics industrial base, we have contracts that run over very long time periods, both commercial and military. So the impacts of things like COVID, which for the rest of the world seems like it was a long time ago, are still rattling their way through the system and putting a lot of pressure on the supply chain, and probably will for a couple of years to come. So as we look at the need to continue scaling, all of us who are primes are out working very actively with our supply chain to make sure they have the ability to rally if we need to do that. It was brought up to me by some of my colleagues as we spoke about this presentation, thinking about how we can help them harden themselves, because they now too are targets as well in this kind of gray zone warfare that Russia and China are out enacting. In terms of where we go for the longer term horizon, I think mainly the things I said, making sure we're focused on operational analysis, talking to the customer, making sure we're getting the requirements right, and then we're designing systems that have the margin and the architecture that allow them to very rapidly adapt to the way war is going to be fought in the future.
Okay, many thanks. So, General, there you mentioned deterrence and how ensuring that those partnerships are solid can do that. But Justin, you point out that you don't think that's working at the moment. A question as well for you. Should GCAP investment be diverted to support 2028 urgent operational military requirements? And also another question that came through a bit earlier, why are you saying 2028? So if you could answer all of that.
So why am I saying 2028? Because if the Ukrainians can't hold this year, summer offensive remains to be seen, but if we can't get them on a better trajectory, then it may be 2 years, maybe even quicker, in terms of the time when Russia would be able to threaten credibly military action on a limited scale against Europe, if the US can't play at scale, either because there's a concurrent challenge in the Indo-Pacific or because a new administration does not want or has signaled that it might not play at scale. 2028 is the time by which a lot of the major Russian officer corps, a lot of their doctrinal prescriptions for what they think they would need to fight NATO at scale as opposed to opportunistically will be largely ready. And it's also bang in the middle of the Davidson window where if China is going to attempt something that risks open conflict with the United States in one way or another, it has a fairly strong incentive to do so before about 2030 when a lot of US capabilities, particularly things like B-21, ABMS, V2 and other things come in at scale. So there is a period of US military vulnerability relative to China in the latter half of this decade as well. So a concurrent challenge is probably most serious if it comes in 27, 28. And the military's job is not to hope, it's to be the insurance policy for what might happen in terms of reasonably foreseeable risks. And in terms of deterrence, I mean, the key is, in some ways it's good news. Air power is the key to deterrence against the Russians, full stop. The armies cannot be ready in time to deter the Russians in terms of convincing them that they cannot seize and hold a patch of territory and convince us we can't push them out, politically speaking. Air power can. Air power is absolutely the answer we need. The Russian army cannot melt into the population. It's not an insurgent force that can hide from air power. To threaten us, the Russian army has to deploy tanks, APCs, EW equipment, massive gun lines, and a really cumbersome push logistics system in the field and stay there. Can you imagine what tactical air power, even just European tactical air power, can do to that if we can push the door open? They will not risk conflict if they think we can push the door open. But that means SEAD, DIAD, and that means OCA. We don't have the munitions and we don't have the training yet in Europe. So that's got to be the focus.
Okay, many thanks. Julia, a question for you. So what should space powers focus their strategies on to be adequately prepared for the next war?
I love that question. I think it's really important for states to know why they are space powers in the first place and how that fits itself into being sort of a national power, a national identity. In terms of focusing on sort of growth and building your space power, it kind of goes without saying that you have to have some degree of momentum. Otherwise, you're going to degrade. If you look at sort of Russia as a declining disruptor, their space sector is indicative of a power that has not had any momentum. You lose a skills base, you lose sort of the hard infrastructure and the inability to actually deliver on your promises. I doubt that we're going to see Sphera actually develop into a constellation or a fleet in the next 5 years. But in terms of growing space powers, you have to understand sort of why are you building this and then maintain that momentum and see it through. Are you doing it because you have to fill an operational capacity or some sort of need? Or is it to really just build up that skills base so that you can at some point deliver? I think for the UK specifically, it's going to be a point on delivering on being allied by design and where it sort of situates itself both with Europe, but as its relationship or special relationship with the US. Has it grown too dependent perhaps on the US is going to be a question, particularly for the next upcoming months. But understanding why are you doing specific maneuvers to make yourself more sovereign if you don't have necessarily a need for that. And then eventually it sort of decelerates and you lose these programs. But I think all of it speaks to the fact that if you've started a program and you've stated your strategy that fits into your national strategy, then to see it through and make sure that the demand is met, but also continued and has some sort of longevity is critical. Not only I've spoken about the UK, but for even smaller space powers, understanding why are you going to space, or why are you doing space? It's not just to become or sort of retrofit US strategy onto your own strategy, but to really recognize areas of critical need and areas to develop national structure and to see them through.
Okay, many thanks. And Brendan, quite a few questions coming in for you. First of all, how does the strength of the Chinese Air Force compare to the US Air Force? But also, how is the Russian Air Force partnering with the Chinese Air Force?
Yeah, great question. So the U.S. is still the biggest and strongest Air Force, but then China gets to concentrate all their aerospace power in and around China. We have, obviously, our forces are spread across the world. So when you look at the interregion, it is a lot closer. And keep in mind, China they live in a bad neighborhood, and they have problems with a lot of their neighbors. They have problems in the South China Sea, they have problems with India, and potentially in Central Asia. And so their Air Force is absolutely far capable enough to deal with any of those problems. The other thing is, China is planning to play a home game. So they don't need to do all the things that the United States and our allies and partners are going to do. So they haven't developed a huge tanker fleet because they're going to be based out of China. We continue to tell them politically that we are not going to strike deep into the mainland for fear of escalating that conflict. Well, they plan to have sanctuary there. So what they plan to do, as I said, is this counter-intervention, keep you out long enough. So again, it's not really, it's a hard question of you can't compare our Air Force to their Air Force. You have to do their aerospace capability against the mission set versus ours and our mission set, and that's where it becomes very difficult.
Okay.
On the Russian side, just really quickly, they continue to talk about what they're doing with the Russians, and that very much is flying in the same airspace in the same direction, and that's kind of where it ends. It's not even flying next to them in most cases, much less flying with them. And so that is a long, not that they may not get there, but it's certainly not there now.
Okay, thank you. And somebody in the audience has pointed out that actually Julia and Justin spent a lot of time focusing on Russia and Ukraine and the threat there. Do we risk taking our eyes off China and the threat, which is the ability to be even more serious, and where the need for space to access denied areas and counter adversary threats in space is even more stark? Julia?
Absolutely. I think it's harder to discuss things longer term, especially if you've seen the pace of movement for space development and even just the past 4 years. Considering even 4 years from now where space is going to be is quite difficult. But considering China, it's important to realize that as opposed to Russia, China is a well-resourced power. And so what the West is up against is a completely different animal. And perhaps the lessons that I've drawn, I tried to be a bit broader in my conceptualization of it, but it's a different beast. And I think if we're talking about not only fighting sort of peer-to-peer or whatnot, but to also consider on a lower level, are we adequately addressing our supply chain? Have we considered our resources, whether it's minerals like gallium or even semiconductor chips, but have we considered things that are a bit longer term? And resources seems sort of a bit, unsexy in some ways if you'd rather talk about exquisite capabilities. But I think exactly, yes, it is a problem to consider our short-term immediate threats compared to pacing threats, but China is absolutely the one moving forward. I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, as a Marine, we look at it this way. Are you worried about the alligator closest to the boat or the biggest alligator? You certainly have to worry about both of them, but in the long term, China is on the path to being a much greater challenge, not necessarily enemy, it's avoidable if deterrence works, as the name of the conference, but it is a huge challenge we need to keep the eye on.
Okay, many thanks. I just want to open up to the audience after that initial flurry of questions. It's quite hard for me to see any hands going up, but there is a hand over here. If you could bring the microphone just to the press area, that would be marvelous. Thank you.
Chris Bogock, I'm an aerospace journalist and commentator. Well, Justin, you and I are just about the only people in the UK who have expressed the least bit of skepticism about the Tempest GCAP program, its need and its speed. But don't you think it's now acquired an unstoppable momentum?
So basically, I would say if you look at it from a capability point of view, there is no argument currently for spending loads of money on GCAP. But if you look at it from a sovereign decision to stay in the industrial game, then it needs to be an ongoing program of work. My primary hierarchy of needs in terms of where I would be putting resource if, God forbid, I had any power, would be that GCAP is completely impossible if there's a war in Europe in the coming 5 years. because the global economy will completely tank. We'll have to divert everything to fighting that war. And by the way, GCAP's also impossible if the US and the Chinese go to war. So, if you care about GCAP, you need our defenses to be in order so that we don't have to fight the Russians this decade. Because otherwise, none of those programs are going to happen. It wouldn't be the first program where resources had to be pushed around in year. But yeah, I understand the arguments for doing it. I still have concerns on the affordability. I think we need to commit more resource to doing it properly if the promise of GCAP as it's generally conceived is to be realized. And it's notable that the US Air Force is saying it can't potentially afford NGAD, which, given that NGAD already has prototypes flying around and is their third or fourth attempt at a combat stealth aircraft, and they're very good at it, and it's US funding. If the US thinks NGAD is maybe unaffordable within the USAF program, then I think we probably need to look at very carefully how we're going to do this in Europe. But for the immediate term, you've got to stop the Russians from trying to test NATO militarily in this decade. Otherwise, everything else is kind of irrelevant.
And it ties into another thought about the fact that we have got another UK strategic defence review being announced. What do you want to see from that? Do you just fear that it could take too long?
I mean, yeah, I understand that the incoming government promised a defence review, and particularly if they want to make a significant change in direction, they need to be able to show they're working. Otherwise, they'll be slaughtered in the press. But I think basically the requirements are pretty clear if the stated focus of the new government is what John Healey has repeatedly said, i.e. NATO. It's ammunition, spares, flying hours, and mission focus on training to fight the Russians with our closest allies. It's really simple.
Okay, thank you. And it ties into another question being put forward by Stuart Ather, focusing solely on the 3 to 4 year horizon and not investing in developing capability that delivers future operational advantage, he says is a dangerous proposition. It risks undermining our deterrent posture and leads to attritional warfare. Surely it's a balance between investment for today and tomorrow. General, would you like to take that?
That's a great question, and appreciate that, Stewie, because I can see you over there. It certainly is a balance we have to work through today. I sense that there's inevitably this, and we see it often in the U.S., between the combatant commanders who have to fight today and the service side that is looking to the future. And that tension is an important part of the conversation that needs to occur. From my perspective, I think we need to acknowledge the point that, hey, future capabilities are going to be expensive. How do we, and I'll say this from an industry perspective, continue to work to drive the prices to something that gives the numbers that will be affordable in the long term? That's hard. Arguably, that will be a challenge, but it is something that absolutely must be worked through together, because there's give and takes as you look at requirement growth and inevitably the warfighter that wants more and more, but we can't afford to have that. So what does that incremental roadmap look like over time that brings in capabilities, not all at once, but in a time period that's affordable? Also, though, it's prioritized to the things that the warfighter needs today while we look to the future. And that discussion absolutely needs to happen.
And General, you talked earlier about the need to make sure that we have this defensive position to safeguard the future for our sons and daughters. How do you think, this question has come through, how should we persuade populations as well as governments of the need to be ready to fight? You're looking at that from a forces viewpoint, but what about the wider population? What kind of messaging do you think would be needed?
Well, first off, there needs to be transparency to facilitate that understanding of the environment across, whether you look at it from a diplomatic, informational, the powers that are out there are areas that we need to discuss with the public to inform them. And as you can imagine right now across, with elections going on and everything else going on, it's difficult to gain the attention of the public out there to help inform them on why this is important to us. I come at it from the perspective, particularly engaging policymakers. If it's your son or daughter, what do you want them to have? Nothing but the best, right? And I feel that resonates with people. And so as we personalize it to a certain extent to talk about what we're asking those that serve their nations to do, I think the impetus is on us to get that right and work hard to have these difficult conversations and then put the resources we need so that if it's your children you're sending out there to fight for us, we've given them the very best.
Okay, thank you. Justin.
I'd just say most of the reason the public don't necessarily show much interest is because they think things are fine, because they think that if it was as serious as all that, then the military would be visibly doing something about it, and the government would be visibly doing something about it. Your own inaction and timidity in public is partly what's undermining your messaging. And the same goes, by the way, for pitches to your governments. As I said, if you want governments to start funding you and taking you seriously as a response to crisis to urgently build towards war, change your pitch to reflect that reality. Be honest about the threat and what you're trying to do to fix it. Because what you currently see is a lot of militaries trying to have their cake and eat it. Say, well, we're going to mostly continue with our programs because we basically got it right. We just need a load more money and please, take us a lot more seriously. If it was actually the crisis, which, by the way, it absolutely is, people would expect a lot of people to be doing different things. And again, I've had so many people in so many air forces tell me, well, if we have to fight in 2 to 3 years, that would change everything. It's your jobs.
Well, we're going to hear a little bit later on from Finland's Air Chief about the concept in Finland of total preparedness as well. I'm going to go into that and look at that kind of cross-societal approach. But certainly, I think your words are really resonating, Justin, certainly from the response in the room. We've just got time for a few more questions. And there's a question just at the back in the middle. Yes. And there's one, oh, sorry, I didn't see you at the front as well. So I'll take those 2 questions. Thank you. Thank you very much. Who'd like to take that question? Justin.
Stay in your lanes. If you're not ready to fight Russia on your doorstep, you cannot fight China at 8,500 miles. They have 10 times the capabilities, 10 times the magazine depth, far more ability to complete kill chains, and far more ability to mess with your economy, your cyber infrastructure, and everything else. If you're not ready to fight the Russians, forget about trying to fight the Chinese.
Julia.
I'll take a different stab at that one and say, well, in the same vein, you're absolutely right, but you have to be ready to fight both, and that's where I go to flying together, flying with each other, interoperable. The perfect example we were talking about earlier in the week was a British aircraft carrier with a U.S. Marine squadron embarked on it. That sends the message to the Japanese and probably to the Russians, hey, this is a real thing. Our allies and partners are working together that we can interoperate and act as one anywhere, and all of us acting as one anywhere absolutely goes to deterrence toward Russia and China. We just need to do it allied by design, integrated, industrial bases spread across the world, absolutely planned to be, across all classification levels from the start. That's how you do it.
Okay, Julia.
I think just 2 points. One, pick your priority, otherwise you're going to get stretched too thin. I think the US being drawn into multiple conflicts very far away from each other is a risk, not only for the US, but also for its partners and feeling that they can depend on the US. And the second point is know your place in the world. I think the UK, for example, struggles with understanding or even communicating where it sits in the world. Just to give an example, in '99, Blair gave a speech called The Pivot of Power. It essentially rejected isolationism in favor of being a global actor and participating and sort of focusing on like-minded allies. Then a short bit later, it focused on sort of being a bridge between Europe and US. And now in 21, we've got the IR saying that the UK is a pivot. I think moving forward, I'm not sure what's going to happen in the next defense review, but realistically, where is the UK? Where does it see itself? And in some ways, it kind of feels like whiplash, but not really communicating where the UK sees itself in the world, and then also communicating how it fits into those trends is actually a massive risk.
Okay, thank you. And a question here.
Hi, Tim Robinson from Aerospace magazine, the Aeronautical Society. Picking up on Tom's point on the balance between attritable drones. What's an attritable drone? How survivable does it need to be? How big, I'm probably throwing this open to Jeffrey and Justin as well, how big do you think this niche is of the kind of middle sort of section of attritable drones that are lower cost enough to buy lots of them and to deploy at scale, but also are not just going to be decoys and just get wiped out en masse? Thanks.
Tom, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, I think a lot of it depends upon the TTP, tactics, techniques, procedures that the warfighter develops. I see a need for both. Obviously, there's probably a higher volume with the truly attritable that's out there, so understanding how to manufacture those at rates akin to weapons is going to be necessary, and keep the cost point, relatively there as well. I do believe, in fact, I was just talking with one of our design teams that's doing our advanced development work in this area yesterday about, I believe that the not necessarily attritable, but collaborative combat aircraft is something that is going to be here to stay. It's going to be an important part of the force structure, and we as industry need to understand and how to step up and find that right balance between survivability, tactical lethality, and affordability, because we don't want them. The F-35 is a great aircraft. We're partnered with Lockheed in delivering that to all the F-35 partner nations, but we can't have these CCAs be that price. We have to find that right balance.
The only thing I'd add is, first, that operational analysis that we talked about earlier really needs to get done to a level of specificity that works through the different mixing and matching there. The other two things I'd highlight to you, and this is something that I know is being talked about, is how do you organize, train, and equip to do that? And then does it really deter China? Two hard questions that I think we need to think our way through as we go forward in procuring those types of capabilities.
Okay, many thanks. It is all we have time for, but some of the questions that we haven't got to, we'll be able to pose later in the other sessions, so do please pose them again when we hit those talking points. Thank you very much, and 5 really strong calls to action there, so please do give the panel a round of applause. Thank you.